Dateline, July 20th, 2012. This is Ralph K. Ginorio. Give me a few minutes to straighten my tie, and I'll give you something to consider. Item, the American Dream. What is the American Dream? Is it, as we have been told through our immigrant traditions from Ellis Island, that every generation can and should do better than the last generation? My great-grandfather came over from Kilkenny, Ireland in 1902, went through Ellis Island, was an armed bank security guard, up through the end of the Depression when he retired with a gold watch. My grandfather was a college graduate from Boston University who, instead of using the degree in banking that his parents insisted that they get, became an engineer and then a chief engineer on a tugboat in New York Harbor. My mom went to Hunter College and became the first policewoman in her Connecticut town, and she eventually earned the highest conviction rate up till that point in the history of her police force. I went to Bates College and became a teacher. Every generation, more out of the ethnic ghetto into the wider American middle class. Every generation a slightly cushier lifestyle. The American dream, as most people consider it, has been lived by that aspect, and frankly by all aspects of my family. I'm very lucky. I think many of us have the same sort of story behind us. But in essence, that American dream is a materialistic dream, a dream of a bigger house, farther out into the suburbs, a nicer car. The real American dream started before there was an America. It started with traditions going back to ancient times. It really starts with the book of Genesis. According to Genesis 1, we are made in God's image, in the image of God. Now, whether you yourself are a Christian or Jewish, are Muslim, or are a non-monotheistic believer, or are not a believer at all, this belief, this root conviction at the heart of what became Western civilization, that human beings are made in the image of God, have a bit of the soul of God in us, matters. It matters to the formation of laws and governments. So, I'm going to express the American dream in a simple if-then statement. And I've hinted where I'm going with the first if already. If, as monotheists believe, that all human beings have priceless value, that's the first if. And it does come from Genesis 1. If all people are made in God's image, then all people are precious, my precious. They're priceless. You cannot exploit, you cannot use a human being for your own belly interests without doing something unrighteously wrong. Because if you do harm to the least of these, Jesus says, you do harm to me. In a society run by believers for believers, that limits the power of people to exploit one another, and it limits the power of government to some extent. You don't have human beings being spent like dollars to create the Great Wall, like in China. Yes, there's misery and hardship in Western civilization, because the preciousness of human life is only the first if. The second if all human life is precious, as monotheists believe, and if, as the Enlightenment philosophers say, all human beings can learn reason, in response to the 150 years of brutal religious warfare unleashed by Gutenberg's press and the Protestant Reformation, European philosophers began considering notions that ultimately led to John Locke, to Descartes, to, having trouble with the Frenchman, Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, to notions of the social contract, to notions of inalienable human rights. Enlightenment philosophers, in an age of European monarchs aping Asiatic absolutism, King of France sees a bureaucracy in China where the Son of Heaven rules. So King Louis XIV becomes Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, and establishes the first fully functioning bureaucracy to run day-to-day affairs in France. During that time of absolute monarchy, philosophers and freethinkers began considering this notion. Instead of government being placed above us by God or the gods to regulate and control us because we can't be trusted to do that ourselves, what if human beings came together and contracted out a hireling government to take care of building the bridges and the roads and the other things that we need collectively? But we hired it. The individual has primacy over the government. That's the social contract, in short. What about inalienable human rights? Rights that you cannot righteously separate away. Rights that Locke and others call life, liberty, and property. You can't take somebody's life away unless they're a murderer or you're a soldier on the battlefield. Not righteously, anyway. Power of life and death is not yours. Liberty, a person's ability to dream big dreams and pursue them. And property, which is the only security against an all-powerful government. Private property gives people the ability to say no to the powerful and the wealthy. This notion that we contract out the government, this notion that just by being born, we have rights that are inalienable, that cannot be separated from us, is at the core of the American dream, because if all people can reason, as the Enlightenment philosophers say, then all people, here's the then all people should be free to pursue their destiny untrammeled by a do-gooder government, untrammeled by the best and the brightest and their laws and strictures. Freedom requires the ability to dream big dreams, as the first European arrivals in this giant wilderness must have had. The big dreams of building God's new Israel, of building a new and better world. If all people have priceless value and should be treated as precious, and all people can learn reason, we're not born with it, then all people should be free. And that radical notion is behind a society in this nation unprecedented in the history of the world. A society of free people coming together and experimenting every generation with what that freedom actually means. But none of it is possible without the ability to make your own ideas take form through your own individual action, without worrying about what the commissar would say. If all people have priceless value and all people can learn reason, then all people should be free.